Our speaker tonight is an American linguist, a philosopher, cognitive scientist, political activist, author, and a lecturer. He's a professor emeritus at MIT, author of such books as Secret Lies of Democracy, Year for 501, and Necessary Illusion. He knows some of the father of modern linguistics and a political dissident. Let's face it, he's a really man who needs no introduction. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Noam Chomsky.
Sorry to keep you waiting. You can blame it on Boston traffic and MapQuest. Somewhere in downtown Boston. I'll say a couple of words about what the immediate prospects look like with the Middle East generally, Israel-Palestine, particularly with the transition to the Obama administration. Actually, Obama himself hasn't really said much about foreign policy altogether, but he has made one declaration on Israel-Palestine, which was interesting and informative. It was when he introduced George Mitchell as his emissary for the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is a serious choice if he's given any leeway. So far, apparently, his instructions are only to listen, and to listen only to a few people. So, for example, the elected government in Palestine he's not allowed to listen to. That's off limits. And in fact, as soon as the government was elected, and arguably the only free election in the Arab world, the United States and Israel, of course, immediately turned to punishing the population for voting the wrong way, and punish them very harshly. That's the population of Gaza, which already had been under a terrific punishment for years. This went side by side with the constant orations about our yearning for democracy and our promotion of democracy everywhere. That's normal. So Mitchell's allowed to listen to some people, but not the elected government. In fact, it would be hard to listen to them because Israel would have been part of the government in prison without charges. Just I don't like them. I'll come back to the reasons later if there's time. But Obama did make a declaration when he introduced Mitchell. He said that, of course, our prime concern is the security and safety of Israel. Security and safety of Palestinians is, if it's concerned at all, it wasn't worth mentioning. But he said there's one constructive proposal on the table from the Arab side, and he singled it out. It's the Arab peace plan. And he said that's a very constructive idea. He said it calls for the Arab states to normalize relations with Israel, and he thinks that they should proceed to go ahead and do that, and then we can move forward. Well, Obama is an intelligent person. He chooses his words carefully, I presume, and he knows perfectly well that that was not the Arab League peace plan. The Arab League peace plan was a call to expedite the international consensus, which includes essentially everyone except the United States and Israel, which have blocked it for 30 years, to join the international consensus on a two-state settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict on the recognized international order, perhaps with minor and mutual modifications. It's the official wording of the U.S. government, as long as it joined the world on this issue up till 1971. And the Arab League peace plan, once again, reiterated a call to implement this proposal. It did go a little beyond it. It said in the context of this settlement, the Arab states would proceed to normalize relations with Israel. Now, Obama very carefully eliminated the core of the plan, from which we can only conclude that the U.S. will continue its stand of extreme rejectionism, which has blocked it for over 30 years, and he called on the Arab states to normalize relations with Israel without the two-state settlement on which it's conditioned. That's so far his only declaration of policy on the issue. Now, it is elaborated further in an important speech by our Senator John Kerry, who was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He gave a speech at the Brookings Institution a week or two ago, in which he elaborated further what the administration's plans are. And that's worth reading carefully. I'll give you a couple of quotes from it. He started by saying that there has been what he called a tectonic shift in Middle East geopolitics, and that offers us new opportunities, along with the Arab Peace Initiative, which he says is the basis on which to build a regional roadmap that enlists moderate Arab nations to play a more active role in peacekeeping and to paint a clearer picture than before of the rewards that peace will bring to all parties. The term moderate Arab nations means primarily the brutal Egyptian dictatorship and the most extreme radical fundamentalist dictatorship in the world, namely Saudi Arabia. They're moderate because the term moderate has a technical meaning in international affairs. It means you do what the United States says. Okay, that makes you a moderate. So we want to get the Arab moderates together with Israel and the United States. And what are the rewards that peace will bring? Well, the rewards are that the moderates will be rescued from Iran, which is their main concern, according to Kerry. In fact, he says that the tectonic shift is that the rise of Iran has created an unprecedented willingness among moderate Arab nations to work with Israel, and this could be the groundwork for peace. So he says we have to fundamentally reconceptualize the Israel-Palestine conflict as a regional problem and not an Israel-Palestine problem. So we shift away from the Israel-Palestine conflict where, according to the standard dogma, the United States has tried hard, but so far without success, to reach a political settlement. We have to give up on that failed effort to which we've dedicated so much effort, and turn to a coalition of Israel and the moderate states with us against Iran. That's the new reconceptualization of the issue. How do we begin? He says, until now, the problem has been that for years everyone has talked of the need to give the Israelis a legitimate partner for peace. They didn't have a legitimate partner for peace up until now. I'll go through the record of how they didn't have a legitimate partner, but that's the administration position. Now they finally do because of the Arab peace plan, the Arab initiative. He says, how do we begin this process? Well, we begin with the Arab peace initiative. This bold step was proposed in 2002. We cannot underestimate the importance of the fact that through this initiative, every Arab country has now agreed to the basic formulation of land for peace and the recognition of the state of Israel and the normalization of relations. But he didn't say what land for peace is. It could mean anything. The ultra-right Israeli government also talks about land for peace and a little pocket of land somewhere. And the fact that everyone knows in the world what land for peace means. It means the international consensus that the U.S. has brought, a settlement on the international border. Kerry knows it too, Obama knows it. And when they mention it, that tells us everything we have to know. And he goes on to explain it further. He says that until now, Israel had no legitimate partner for peace. And what we heard from the Arabs was the three no's of Khartoum in 1967. No negotiations with Israel. But now, he says, among the moderate Arab nations, we hear a different three no's. No to Iran. And with the no to Iran and the willingness to move forward toward normalization of relations with Israel and to join with the United States and Israel in alliance against Iran, will have reconceptualized the problem. Well, did anything happen between 1967 and the Arab Initiative? Yeah, a number of things happened. For example, immediately after the 3 no's of Khartoum, in fact, in less than a year, Egypt began initiatives to try to reach a peace settlement. Now, it was possible to kind of keep that quiet for a while, but in 1971, in February 1971, President Sadat of Egypt offered a full peace treaty to Israel, formally, full peace treaty, nothing for the Palestinians, in return for Israeli withdrawal from occupied Egyptian territory. Israel recognized it to be a genuine peace offer, decided to reject it because they wanted to expand. They said we will not accept the international order. At that time, the main concern with the interest was expanding into the Northeastern Sinai, where Israel was driving out thousands of Bedouin farmers, destroying towns and villages, planning to build a huge city, a city of 1 million people, a seaport, Yamit, and settlements around it. Well, Israel made an important decision at that point, a fateful decision. They had a choice between security and expansion. A peace treaty with Israel, with Egypt, would end the security problem. That's the major Arab military force. If that's a peace treaty, nothing else matters. There was nothing for the Palestinians in this peace agreement. They chose instead expansion. And in fact, the policy since then has been to choose expansion over security, and it remains so. Now, the crucial question was what the United States would do, as always. The United States is the dominant force. There was an internal bureaucratic battle about it in Washington. The Secretary of State in the State Department, William Rogers, wanted to continue with the official U.S. position, which is that Israel should withdraw from the occupied territories, and there should be a settlement. At that time, the U.S. didn't get fall for, nobody was calling for a two-state settlement at that time, just withdrawal from the occupied territories. Henry Kissinger, who was National Security Advisor, was opposed to that. He preferred the policy which he called stalemate, meaning no negotiations, just force. He won out in the competition. The U.S. backed Israel in its choice of expansion over security. That led directly to the 1973 war, which was a very close thing for Israel. And then came negotiations. And finally, at Camp David in 1978 and 79, the United States and Israel accepted Sadat's 1971 proposal. It's called here a diplomatic triumph. In fact, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. Our failure to accept it in 1971 led to a very dangerous war, a lot of suffering, nuclear alerts, and so on. But the U.S. and Israel finally effectively accepted Sadat's 1971 proposal. Meanwhile, something else had happened. The issue of Palestinian national rights moved onto the agenda. Explicitly in January 1976 at the Security Council, where the major Arab states, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, others, put forth a resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the international border. Okay, that's the broad international consensus ever since. The U.S. vetoed it. Okay, now U.S. veto is a double veto. First, it doesn't happen, and secondly, it's wiped out of history. So you have to look pretty hard to find it, but it happened. Same thing happened in 1980. The issue shifted to the General Assembly. I won't run through the record, but there are almost annual votes, almost never reported, with numbers like 152 or 151 to 3. Sometimes the United States picks up the Pacific Island or some other dependency, and that's the record right up until now. Obama and Kerry are just saying, yeah, that's what we're going to continue doing. So the lack of legitimate Palestinians have supported this all along. They supported it in 1976, PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. They formally supported it in 1988, formal recognition of this. And Israel and the United States answered that, namely by declaring that there can never be another Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. By their official dictate, Jordan is a Palestinian state. It doesn't matter what the people think, and there can't be another one. That was the formal position. Well, that goes up until today. That's roughly essentially what's happened between the three nodes of Khartoum and today. And that's the issue has never been finding a legitimate partner for peace for Israel, but rather finding it's rather been the U.S. and its Israeli client agreeing to be a legitimate partner for peace, and so far they've refused. And Obama and Kerry say, we're going to continue to refuse. Now, there has been one break in this, an important break. In Clinton's last month in office, January 2001, he agreed to allow negotiations in Taba, Egypt, between high-level Palestinian and Israeli negotiators. And they came very close to reaching a settlement, pretty much in accord with the international consensus. Well, Israel called off the negotiations prematurely, so nothing came of that. But though a lot has happened since 2001, and there's no fundamental difficulty in going back to that, what it would require is a U.S. administration which is willing to tolerate the international consensus which it has been blocking for over 30 years. Exactly contrary to the official story that Kerry and others repeat. Well, Kerry went on to say that we have to proceed now that things are in such good shape, we can reconceptualize, put the Israel-Palestine problem to the side, build up an alliance of moderate Arab nations and Israel with us against Iran. And we have to start somewhere, and he says, most importantly, this means strengthening General Dayton, Keith Dayton, the U.S. general, strengthening General Dayton's efforts to train Palestinian security forces that can keep order and fight terror. Recent developments have been extremely encouraging. During the invasion of Gaza, Palestinian security forces largely succeeded in maintaining calm in the West Bank amidst widespread expectations of civil unrest. Obviously, more can be done, and we can help to do it. Well, let's translate that into English. Israel, with U.S. backing and U.S. arms, was utterly devastating Gaza. It attacked the population's caged, defenseless, perfect opportunity to use high-tech weapons without any reaction. And they were wiping the place out, destroyed most of the agriculture, what was left. It was left with the industry, killed probably 1,500 people. And of course, there were objections to that in the Arab world, enormous objections. They had an advantage that we don't have. There was live television coverage from Gaza, which reached over 100 countries in the world, and people got infuriated. That's why you see the protests in Europe, our world, and elsewhere. But one country was saved from this experience. The television recordings from Al Jazeera, that's banned in the United States, and not by law, just by the government making clear it doesn't want it, and the cable companies going on along. So we were protected from what the rest of the world was seeing. But in the West Bank, of course, there were protests, where there would have been protests if it hadn't been that the security forces that the U.S. trained were so effective in maintaining protests. So in other words, the U.S. has constructed a collaborationist military force in the West Bank, which can pretty well control the population. And that's the most important thing. That's very exciting, Kerry thought. And we have plenty of experience in this. This goes back a century to the pacification of the Philippines and innumerable examples since, so it's an old habit, we're good at it. And that's another sign of progress. Why did Israel attack Gaza altogether? The official reason is because of rocket attacks. And Kerry repeats the standard line: if terrorists in Quincy, Mass were launching rockets into Boston, we'd have to put a stop to it, just as the Israelis were forced to respond. And that's practically the universal stand. It's completely wrong. And it's based on a principle that nobody accepts, neither Kerry or Obama, nor the New York Times, nor you, nor anyone else. The issue is not whether Israel had a right to defend itself. The issue is whether it had the right to use force to defend itself. And that's a totally different issue. No one has a right to use force unless they've exhausted peaceful means. So none of us believe that Putin has a right to use force against Chechnya, practically destroying it in response to Chechen terror, which was pretty severe, because he had a peaceful way to do it, could have pulled out. I doubt if many of you believe that the British had the right to use force in 1776 against the colonists, against the terror of George Washington's army, and there was plenty of terror. They didn't have a right because they could have pulled out, and the same in innumerable other cases. So the real question, which everybody wants to evade, is did Israel have a way to stop the rockets by peaceful means? And the answer is surely. A narrow way to do it would have been to accept the ceasefire for the first time. They had formally accepted ceasefires before, but they'd always broken instantly. Can't go through the record, sort of well. So that would be a narrow way to stop the rockets. Hamas had repeatedly offered ceasefires, in fact, right before the attack once again. But a broader way to use peaceful means is to stop their criminal actions in the occupied territories. Now, all the settlement and development in the occupied territories is flatly illegal. And there is no controversy about that, except maybe some corner of Harvard Law School. Israel was informed immediately in 1967 by its highest legal authorities that any settlement in the occupied territories is in violation of the fundamentals of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions. And that was accepted by the government. General Dayan, who was defense minister in charge of the territories, responded by saying, yeah, we know it's against international law, but we're going to do it anyway. And they can, as long as the U.S. supports it. The World Court recently made a decision, which in fact was unanimous with the U.S. Justice agreeing in a separate declaration, that the Geneva Conventions apply to the occupied territories. So it's all criminal, and it's very serious. I mean, it's designed to break up the West Bank in such a way that Israel will take whatever's of value and will leave scattered cantons, which people can maybe picturesquely lead a donkey or something, but can't survive. And we're paying for it, you and me, because we pay taxes and have been for 35 years. And that continues. In fact, the current plans are to double settlement in the occupied territories. That's on the side of, that's one of the reasons why Kerry and apparently Obama wanted to drop the Israel-Palestine issue and turn to an alliance of Israel, the Egyptian dictatorship, the Saudi fundamentalist religious dictatorship in the United States against Washington's current enemy, Iran. What can students do about this? Just about everything. In fact, what students can do is what students can do best, which is education. This country is desperately in need of an educational process which will suppress decades of consistent lying and distortion and deceit and turn what actually happened almost into its opposite. That's why people like Kerry can give speeches like that and not arouse criticism. In fact, I wouldn't even accuse him of dishonesty. He probably believes it. If you've read the New York Times and listened to the television for the last 30 years, well, what else would you believe? That's the line. Unfortunately, the facts are exactly the opposite. I just barely mentioned them, but you can easily find them out. That's something that students can do quite easily. And can launch an educational campaign in the country, which it desperately needs, to bring it into line with the rest of the world. And I stress, the rest of the world. Everyone but the United States and Israel accepts and is calling for a two-state settlement on the international border and has been for 30 years. That's everyone. That includes Hamas, for example, which is repeatedly called for. It includes Iran, which has said they'll accept whatever the Arab states accept, namely the Arab Peace Initiative. In fact, it's just splendid isolation. United States and Israel, and the power to make a decision which will effectively settle the problem is right here. large majority of Americans already favor, but they're not an active, organized political force. And it wouldn't be beyond the realm of belief that the government might follow popular opinion on some issue if the population is organized, and that requires prior educational work, which is hard and slow and takes time. You've got to counter a lot of lies and slanders and deceit and so on, but that's not, it's not as hard as being put in torture chambers or sent into exile. So it can be done, and it can have a big effect.
Now we're going to open up the floor to questions for Noam Chomsky. You can see in the Carlo already going to. Okay, Carlo is going to be moderating the microphone and have a direct dialogue with Noam Chomsky.
We also just want to ask everyone to be respectful, so when you ask questions, please.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. My name is John. I had two questions for you. First is, have you ever read Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's book, Multitude, and what do you think about it? And second off, with the book you wrote in the 70s, Manufacturing Consent.
What about?
You wrote about how the media works in this country, and I was just wondering, if the media worked properly, what would it be doing that it's not doing today?
What it would be doing is telling the truth. And it would not be two things. First of all, it would be telling the truth. First thing it would be doing is to tell the truth. So instead of the party line, I just gave a few samples, but you can go on and on. There's a standard universal party line reiterated over and over of the kind that I gave some examples of. Now what the media could be doing is telling the truth. And it's not that hard to find out. And the other thing they could be doing is put an end to their extraordinary support for massive state terror, which is quite explicit. So, for example, Thomas Friedman, columnist in the New York Times, they're right in the middle of this brutal attack on Gaza, an attack on caged people, no way to escape, fight someplace out. He wrote an op-ed which said it's a good thing because it may educate Palestinians to accept Israel's terms. If you beat them up enough and you smash them up and kill enough, maybe they'll become educated. You can pull that straight out of the Nazi archives. In fact, the editor of the main Nazi newspaper, Der Stern, was hanged in Nuremberg for inciting terror. Way across something like that. And I could give many examples. So one, the media could tell the truth. Second, they could stop massive incitement of terror and violence. Sounds simple. And it's not just the media. It's the intellectual classes. It's a large part of the academic profession. It's the intellectual climate in which we live. Media are a striking example of it. As for Hart and Negri, I can't really say I read it. I turned a couple of pages, but I'm kind of simple-minded. It was too sophisticated for me. But if anything in there could have been said very simply, it didn't need that apparatus.
Professor, on behalf of all the students at Northeastern and everyone here, thank you for taking the time to come speak to us today. You mentioned something about the importance and our role as students in education. And I want to say, in my experience, this is still a topic that is too taboo to bring up a dinner conversation. People tend to get very defensive about it. Why is that, and how can we go about changing that so that we can promote education? Thank you.
Well, actually, it is a topic that's hard to talk about, though a lot easier than it was in the past. I mean, 10 or 15 years ago, you couldn't have an audience like this. In fact, I had to have police protection in Cambridge at MIT. if I was trying to talk about things like this. If it wasn't armed police protection, there'd be undercover Cambridge police in the audience. I got to know a lot of police that way. But they were there because they were picking up threats of terror and violence. I recall talks at MIT not too many years ago where the police insisted on accompanying me and my wife back to our car afterwards. Okay, that's changed. I mean, especially among younger people, it's changed enormously, including younger Jews. You can see in the polls. They're turning away from the criminal actions of Israel, or just turning people away, even if they don't know the details. Now, I don't like the stress on Israel. It should be on the United States, because it's U.S. policy that's driving it. If the United States was not giving decisive military, economic, ideological aid to ensure that this would continue, it would stop. So yes, you're right. You get a lot of backlash. It's nothing like it was in the past, and it's nothing like what it's going to be in the future, I think. So there's a good opportunity to do it. As for this being the only such case, that's not really true. If you take, this happens to be a striking one, but if you take any issue on which the intellectual community has sort of mobilized, like kind of like the Communist Party, in support of some particular doctrine, it's almost impossible to talk about it. So take another one. We just happened to pass the 10th anniversary of the bombing of Serbia. Okay. Try to talk about that someday. I mean, the hysteria and tantrums and lies that come out are comparable to this. And in fact, in Europe, it's even worse. Well, there's good reason. We have a ton of documentation on what happened there from State Department, from NATO, from observers on the ground, and so on, from the commanding general, General Clark. And it shows something very clear. There was a low level of atrocities going on in Kosovo, and probably most of them due to guerrillas. Equally divided, but nothing like what the U.S. was supporting elsewhere at the same time. And when the bombing began, it was undertaken with the understanding that it was going to sharply increase the level of atrocities, as it did. That's what General Clark told the press. That's what he had warned Washington. So there were plenty of atrocities. They were after the bombing. Okay. Now, what does that say about the intellectual community that was passionately supporting the bombing and talking about how we're opening a new page of history with in which, for the first time in history, the idealistic new world will lead to humanitarian endeavors with complete altruism and so on. It's one of the most sickening displays in intellectual history, where you can't just back down from that and say, I'm sorry, we went berserk. So what you have to do is maintain the lies, and they're maintained, which I'm talking about. And there are other cases. In fact, even cases where there is criticism, there's a strict line beyond which you cannot go. So let's take the invasion of Iraq. Well, there's plenty of criticism of the invasion of Iraq. And in fact, Obama is praised because of his principled criticism of the invasion. But what was his principled criticism of the invasion? He said it's a mistake. It's a strategic blunder. It's going to cost us too much. Is that principle? I mean, you could have read that in Pravda in 1985 about the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. It's a mistake. We shouldn't have done it. In fact, you could have heard it in Nazi Germany from Nazi generals after Stalingrad, who were saying, look, it was a mistake to fight a two-front war. We should have got rid of England first. So sure, it was a mistake. Now, we call that principle. But criticism like that on the part of our enemies, we call utterly unprincipled. Well, try to go beyond that to saying it was a major crime. It's the supreme international crime. It's the crime for which people were hanged in Nuremberg. Same with the Vietnam War. It's already years ago. But you take a look at the criticism of the Vietnam War in the mainstream. You have a lot of it actually in this book that was mentioned before, Manufacturing Consent. I review it extensively. It was very narrow. the harshest criticism you could get anywhere near the mainstream, NPR or New York Times, anywhere else, is a mistake that cost us too much. That's all you can say about killing 4 million people and leaving 3 countries destroyed, helping create the Khmer Rouge. So, if anybody else did it, we'd probably call for a nuclear war. But we certainly wouldn't say that it's legit. It's enough to say, well, we made a mistake, it cost us too much. But that's a line you can't cross. Of course you can, but you get the same reaction that you find if you try to touch this holy subject. And that's more educational work that has to be done right here.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Dr. Chomsky, for your oral speech. I thought it was very informative and beneficial. My question is that with the rising pro-Arab sentiments within the American political spectrum and the American public,
with the rising
pro-Arab sentiments among the American public and the American political spectrum, and with the new coming of Obama's administration, do you believe that America's current foreign policy of pro-Israel may have a chance to shift to a more pro-Arab stance in relation to Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the near future?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that there's rising pro-Arab sentiment. In fact, by every index around, Arabs are probably the most hated, despised, condemned group. As a group, it's really racist criticism. But there is rising criticism of Israeli actions, which is much too narrowly focused, because it should be criticism of U.S. Israeli actions. So like when Amnesty International, for example, called for war crimes investigations after the Israeli attack on Gaza, they added, war crimes investigations with the U.S. involved, because the weapons supplied are coming from here. Constant flow. There's more coming right now. Obama has gone beyond Bush. His new budget announces a plan $30 billion of armaments to Israel over the next 10 years, independent of circumstance. It's from here. In fact, right in the middle of the Gaza war, the Pentagon announced new shipments of arms to Israel. And it was quite interesting. There were a few questions asked. How come you're shipping arms to Israel right in the middle of the war, which is being fought with U.S. arms? Well, the Pentagon had an answer, an instructive answer, which I think was correct. They said, well, these arms aren't being sent for Israel to use. They're being pre-positioned for the U.S. to use. In other words, one of Israel's services to the United States, and the reason why it gets such support, is it's essentially an offshore military base. We pre-position arms there for what will be called enforcing stability, which is a euphemism for aggression and intervention. Okay. So yes, there is a rising criticism that's much too narrowly focused. We should focus it on ourselves primarily. One should always look at oneself first, whatever the issue is. But in this case, it happens to be a decisive factor. It's increasing, and I think the thing to do is to make it increase and get it to be informed. Not just anger, but informed anger, understanding what's happening and why.
What's where the funding is coming from? What is the Israeli side of this organizing? The helicopter and so on. I was wondering if you could talk about it a little bit about where Palestinian militaries are going to work on, and maybe just a little bit more about their organization.
Well, I did talk a little bit about where Palestinian armies are coming from, mainly from the United States. And that's what Kerry was praising, the sending of U.S. arms and in fact training by a U.S. general with the help of the Jordanian dictatorship to create a force, a collaborationist force that will suppress the Palestinians in the West Bank and prevent them even from expressing sympathy for their friends and families in the other half of Palestine. So that's where the major armaments are coming from. Now, there probably are arms coming in, there certainly are arms coming into Gaza from somewhere. And Israel and the U.S. claim, maybe correctly, that they're Iranian arms. In fact, right after the Gaza attack ended, I've seen reports in the newspapers a couple of days ago. Israel bombed the Sudan, killing a couple of dozen people. Also sank a ship in the Red Sea, claiming that they were bombing what they thought was a convoy of trucks which might be planning to to smuggle arms to Gaza. Okay, we ordinarily call that a crime, a major crime, if anyone committed it except the United States, a client state. But this passed unnoticed because it's taken for granted that Israel has a right to do anything to prevent arms from getting into Gaza. Well, if arms are getting to Gaza, what are they for? And Gaza's not going to invade Israel. What they're for is to defend Gaza against Israeli attack. Okay. Now, should we be opposed to that? Well, the uniform answer is yeah, we have to be opposed to that. In fact, Condoleezza Rice and Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni signed an agreement right after the Gaza war to ensure that there would be blocking any smuggling of arms into Gaza. Okay, all kinds of enforcement measures to be carried out by the Egyptian dictatorship, the moderates, to prevent any smuggling of arms to Gaza. Well, there's no need to enforce any measures to stop smuggling of arms to Israel, which vastly outweigh anything that goes to Gaza, because there is no smuggling. It's given openly and proudly in massive quantities, far beyond anyone in the world. So we massively fund the aggressors. We substantially fund forces in the West Bank to control the population, and the only issue is whether a trickle of arms are allowed to be smuggled into the cage that is being destroyed by a U.S.-Israeli war, which never stops. Remember, Gaza, the occupation of Gaza has not stopped for one day. Talk about disengagement, it's just false. I mean, Israel immediately imposed a siege. The siege is an act of war. The U.S. and Israel, of all countries, agree with that. In fact, Israel's doctrine is that even impeding access to the outside world is an act of war. That was one of their main official reasons for invading Egypt in 1956, along with France and England, and for launching the 1967 war. It said our access to the outside is being impeded through the Straits of Tiran. Of course, that wasn't siege, it was a minor imposition, but it was enough for war. So that means certainly American supporters, people who call themselves supporters of Israel, should applaud Hamas rockets. And if Israel can launch a war, major war, because its access to the outside world is impeded, surely Hamas has a right to send a few rockets because it's being totally, the siege is total. It has no access, sea, land, or air.
Where does the funding for those rockets come from?
What?
Where does the funding for those rockets come from?
Where does it come from?
Yeah, do we know that?
They come from Iran, as the United States and Israel claim. There are plenty of similar cases. So, for example, let's take the ultimate horror, the Nazis, okay, absolute depths of barbarism. Well, they complained bitterly that the partisans were getting aided from the outside. Okay? Yeah, and the partisans were carrying out terror. They were being aided from the outside. We didn't hide it. We were proud of it. Or take Afghanistan. Take the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Reagan was pouring in billions of dollars in military aid to the radical Islamic forces that he rounded up to kill Russians. That was the official goal, we're going to kill Russians. And they were sending them in. These are the people who were tearing Afghanistan to shreds after that, and still are. Did we hide it? No. Everyone was proud of sending arms to the resistance against the Russian invasion. So sure, yeah, it could be that Iran is doing the same thing on an undetectable scale, but we should be, by our standards, we should be applauding.
So several times you've mentioned that aside from focusing just on Israel, we should look at the United States as well. And my question is, when we are talking about abuses of human rights and these atrocities that you allege that Israel commits, Do you not find a problem with the fact that we are focusing, other than the United States, only on Israel, as opposed to Iran, as opposed to Darfur, as opposed to any other abuse of human rights in the world? My question is, why are we singling Israel out?
Well, the fact is that criticism of Israel is far below, vastly below, criticism of the Sudan and Darfur and criticism of Iran. Just do a study of the media. You'll very quickly discover that. So there's very little criticism of Israel. There's a little trickle of it, but nothing compared with the movement. There's no Save Gaza movement like the Save Darfur movement. There's no...
Sitting in this room.
Pardon?
Sitting in this room. The movement to save Gaza is sitting in this room.
It's sitting in this room, yeah. And the movement hundreds of...
Where is the movement to protect Israeli rights and Israeli citizens?
That's the entire country. That's the entire country. It's Thomas Friedman saying their right to educate the Gazans by carrying out atrocities. It's Obama and Kerry in the manner that I described. It's the media, suppressing the crimes that Israel has committed and claiming that it was the Arabs who weren't a legitimate partner. It's just overwhelming. I'm glad to see that there is a movement to try to save Gaza, a tiny fraction of what there ought to be. However, despite the scale, there's a crucial moral issue that you're overlooking, a very elementary moral issue. Everyone has a responsibility to face the consequences of their own actions. That's your primary responsibility. I mean, you and I don't, and I'm sure you don't, applaud Iranian mullahs because they criticize U.S. crimes. Maybe they're right, but we don't applaud them for doing that. We applaud Iranians who criticize their own crimes. People like Shireen Abadi or Akbar Ganji and others. And it's the same in Russia. I'm sure there are plenty of, in the old days, in the Russian Communist Party, there are plenty of people in the Russian Communist Party who criticized U.S. crimes. Did we praise them? No, we thought they were grotesque. I mean, even if they were right. The people we praised were the dissidents who were criticizing their own crimes. Now that's a moral principle so elementary that we really shouldn't even have to talk about it. And it's a moral principle we understand in the face of enemies. But we can't look ourselves in the mirror and draw the obvious conclusion, independent of the scale of the atrocities, that we should be looking primarily at our own role. Okay? So if we were funding Hamas, let's say, then it would make a lot of sense for us to focus on Hamas crimes. But we're not. We're destroying them because they were the elected government. We didn't like them. What we're doing is giving overwhelming assistance at every level, diplomatic, military, doctrinal, any level that you can think of, to supporting and implementing Israel's crimes, which are vastly beyond those of Hamas, but even if they were less, we should still be concentrating on them. Similarly, we should be concentrating on the crimes of the Egyptian dictatorship, because we're funding them and supporting them. And that's vastly more important than the crimes of, say, Sri Lanka, which are pretty terrible, but we're not funding them. And that's an elementary moral principle. I mean, if we can't accept that principle, we should simply admit that we are not part of the moral arena. It's one of the most elementary principles I can think of. But it's almost totally, I'm not criticizing you, this is commonly accepted. This is almost a universal attitude in the United States. We have to condemn other people's crimes. We can't look at our own. Our own we either deny or suppress. So, for example, there's a substantial movement in the United States to have a congressional resolution condemning the crimes of Turkey in the Armenian genocide of 1915. Okay? Is there a congressional resolution calling for condemning our own extermination of the indigenous population? I haven't heard of one. And that's millions and millions of people, and they know what they're doing. We read John Quincy Adams talks about the fate of that hapless race of North Americans American Indians that were exterminated, his word, with such merciless perfidy. They knew exactly what they were doing. Do we have any congressional resolutions about it? Do we do anything to help the victims? Do we have monuments, museums? No. What we concentrate on is Turkish crimes against Armenians. Yeah, bad crimes. But what does that tell you about the moral level of the country? There's example after example of that. I really think you should think it through. It is it's a standard view. It's understandable that people would accept it, but I don't think you should accept it uncritically. I think one should examine it.
Hi, Professor. Just simply, regarding to what we talked about tonight, do you think anyone is listening to you? Do you feel ignored? How come your ideas have been broken into mainstream America?
Is anybody listening?
Yeah.
As I said, it's very different from what it was not long ago. I mean, about maybe 10 years ago, at MIT, say, and around this neighborhood generally, meetings were being simply broken up. There was a small scattering of people. It was the same thing at China. When I started talking about the Vietnam War, right after Kennedy launched the war, something which almost nobody knows because it's press, but it happened. So right after Kennedy launched the war in 1962, I and a number of other people started trying to give talks about it. Well, I can describe those early talks. Sometimes they'd be in a neighbor's living room with 3 people. Sometimes it would be in a church with 4 people. The minister, the organizer, a drunk who walked in off the streets and somebody wanted to kill you. And that's what it was like for years. It finally got to be a huge mass movement. Well, that's the way things happen. Of course, you wouldn't. If it was getting into the mainstream media, you'd think you're doing something wrong, because their task is not to provide the kind of information and insight or even moral principles that would undermine power, because they're part of a system of power. Okay, now I don't say that it's not uniform. Things we get through. It's not a totalitarian state. So yes, things do get through, but the tendency is overwhelming to protect power and insulate it from serious criticism. It can have marginal criticism, like you can criticize power by saying we made a mistake, or you can criticize particular bad people. Donald Rumsfeld authorized torture. Okay, you can criticize that, but what you can't do is, what you're blocked from doing very much, is any kind of an institutional critique, which says, look, this is the way things work consistently, systematically, and these are the reasons for it. That's very rarely allowed. So that's understandable. They're part of a system of power. They don't expose themselves or criticize it. But that, you can get around that, and all the popular mass movements have. That's why we have a more civilized country than we used to.
I know you hate the media, we all do. But have you tried to spread your message through the mainstream media? Through the mainstream media.
To the news media?
Yeah. Have you attempted?
How do you attempt? I'll give you some examples. If I put a lot of energy into it, I'd get more than I do. But I just don't think it's that important, frankly. To have one op-ed in the New York Times in 20 years seems to be less important than constantly talking to groups like this who can actually do something. If you want to know some examples, they're pretty striking. For example, I'll give you one case. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. No pretext at all. They told me the reasons. They wanted to end the embarrassing Palestinian negotiations office, which they didn't like because they wanted to take away West Bank. So they invaded. They killed 15,000 to 20,000 people, practically destroyed southern Lebanon and Beirut. They were able to do it for the usual reasons. The U.S. vetoed Security Council resolutions trying to stop the slaughter, kept sending arms, and so on. Finally, Reagan decided it was enough, so he told Israel to call it off. And they have to follow orders, so they called it off. Well, then there was an outburst of euphoria. great humanitarians, we ended the slaughter, everything's going to be wonderful. At the time, I happened to be reading both the Israeli press, the Hebrew press, and the Lebanese press. And it was pretty obvious that something bad was brewing. There were going to be further crimes. And the one and only time in my life, I submitted a 1,000-word article to The Nation, not the New York Times, to The Nation, saying, look, here's what's happening, here's what the press is reporting in Lebanon and Israel, so something's bad going to happen, it's not the euphoria that everyone's describing. It was never even acknowledged. Okay. A week later, Israel invaded West Beirut, and you had the Sabra Shatila massacre. Actually, I was so infuriated about that I took off every night for the next couple of months and wrote a book about it. Faithful Triangle. It was a small collective in Boston, which was willing to publish things, South End Press. But that's The Nation.
Again, Professor, thank you so much for coming. I have two questions. They're not at all related. One has more to do with history, your history.
Could you pull the mic down a little bit?
You've often criticized Israel because you say you've criticized the fact that it's a Jewish state. What have you been doing to actively speak out against other, say, religious states like England and Spain, including a lot of the states in the Middle East as well? What have you been doing to actively speak out against those?
Well, first of all, criticism of Israel as a Jewish state was a core part of the Zionist movement. I was a critic of Israel as a Jewish state back in the 1940s when I was a youth organizer in the Zionist movement. There was a strong substrate of the Zionist movement which was opposed to the idea of a religious-based state and was in favor of a binational state. Okay, after 1948, that issue died, at least for the time being. And my own view ever since has been that, even when I lived there, which I did, that Israel should have all the rights of any state in the international system, no less and no more. It insists on a lot more. What about it being a Jewish state? Well, yes, I continue to oppose that, and I've written about it. Israel is, by law, the sovereign state of the Jewish people, not of its citizens, in Israel and in the diaspora. So it's my state, but it's not the state of its Palestinian citizens. That's the decision of the High Court, which was put into the basic law, effectively the Constitution. Well, that's not true of England, Spain, or the country you mentioned. England has an established church. I don't like that, and I criticize it, and I have criticized it, but it has almost no effect on anybody's life. Spain is technically Catholic, but you're not Catholic, you don't lose any rights. It is not England is not the sovereign state of the Anglican people in England and abroad. Israel's unique, and these things are not, if this was just symbolism, it wouldn't matter much. Like if it's just a matter of, when the day of rest is, Saturday instead of Sunday, okay, not a big deal. I don't think it should be Sunday here either, but it doesn't matter. It's a minor issue. But it's not that. It's a major issue.
As a follow-up to that.
But let me just make one point about it. Up until, in fact, pretty much until today, there's a technical issue I could go into, 92% of the land in Israel has been reserved to people of Jewish race, religion, and origin. Well, that's a lot more than having a day of rest on Saturday. And there's plenty more like that.
But do people of other religions,
Pardon?
Do other people of other religions in Israel have rights?
They have some rights, but not the right to settle on 92% of the land. And it's not their state. Yeah, they have rights. They can vote. They have limited political rights. They don't have development rights. So, for example, if you compare, say, Arab villages with the Jewish communities, and the difference in the state support is overwhelming. In fact, many of the Arab villages, even those that were there long before the state was established, aren't even recognized.
Agreed. But what about the states in the other states?
The other states in the Middle East are much worse, and I criticize them much more harshly. I've always criticized. I would never I mean, the criticism, well, you heard me talk about Saudi Arabia, and say the same kind of things about Iran, Pakistan, any Islamic republic, any Christian state, any of them, sure. We should criticize them. But we're now back to that elementary moral principle again. I mean, if the United States, to the extent that the United States supports Saudi Arabian radical Islamic tyranny, yeah, we should very much oppose it, and I do. But if, some state in Africa happens to call itself an Islamic state and we don't support it in doing that, well, you should criticize it, but it's not a major issue. Because what's a major issue for us is what we do.
And my second question, you've often spoken about how there's a difference between what we call terrorism. The difference between what we call terrorism, you've cited examples like the American Revolution, the people against the Nazis in World War II. Where do you draw the line between somebody fighting for freedom and somebody specifically inciting terror?
I don't think that's the right way to put. I'll answer the question in a minute, but I don't think that's the right way to pose it. Because people fighting for their freedom can be carrying out terrorist acts and typically do. So the American colonies were fighting for their freedom, but they were also carrying out serious terrorist acts.
And so if a person is carrying out if a person is carrying out a terror act and they kill a child, is that fighting for their freedom, or is that?
No, that may not be, but they may be fighting for their freedom while they're killing children. In the American Revolution, for example, the terrorism was so extreme that a huge proportion of the population fled the country in terror. People were fleeing from Boston, boat people in the middle of winter, going to Nova Scotia to writing pitiful letters about how they were dying in the snow, but they had to get away from the terror of the rebels. That didn't mean that they weren't fighting for the freedom, it just meant they were using terrorist tactics while they were fighting for the freedom. There's no big issue about terrorism, to tell you the truth. I've been writing about it extensively. Lots of books, plenty of articles, ever since 1981, when Ronald Reagan declared a war on terror. He declared that a war on terror would be a centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. Terror is the return to barbarism in our time, the plague of the modern age, and so on and so forth. When George Bush declared a war on terror in 2001, he was redeclaring it, not declaring it. Now, the first war on terror has disappeared from history, and for a very good reason. It immediately turned into a major terrorist war. Reagan's war on terror turned out to be instantly into a major U.S. terrorist war which devastated Central America, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and supported apartheid South Africa, probably killing over 1 million people and plenty more, so nobody wants to talk about that. So that war on terror has kind of disappeared, but it was there, a terrorist war. So I've been writing about it, and then when I've been talking about terrorism, I do something very simple, which anybody can do. I take the U.S. Code. U.S. Code has a definition of terror. That's a pretty good definition. The U.S. Army manuals have a definition which is pretty much the same. British law has a pretty similar definition. And those are the ones that I use. Well, that arouses almost complete hysteria and fury. Because if you use those definitions, it follows directly that the U.S. is a leading terrorist state. And since that conclusion is unutterable, that's not a sentence of English, you're not allowed to use that definition. So ever since the early 80s, there has been, it's kind of comical to watch. Somebody on Mars was watching this, they'd be collapsing on the floor. There have been a series of academic conferences, academic publications, UN meetings, on and on, trying to craft a definition of terrorism. Well, they're a perfectly fine definition, and with official U.S. and British definitions, but you can't use that one, because it doesn't have the right consequences. So you have to somehow craft a definition of terror in which our terror against them isn't terror, but their terror against us is terror. And that's difficult. For that, you need a lot of PhDs and graduates and so on and so forth. And nobody's come up with a good definition of terror that has that characteristic. But it's a fine definition.
In
Not at all. This definition calls that terrorism. If it's either carried out purposely or with the understanding that it's a likely consequence. So you remember in even law, there are many kinds of murder effectively. Killing somebody consciously, purposely is one level. Killing them inadvertently, like, didn't notice somebody crossing the street in the dark, that's different, that's not murder. But there's another category, which in my opinion is even worse than direct murder. And that's the kind that we carry out all the time. That's carrying out crimes when you know that it's going to kill a lot of people, but you're not purposely killing particular ones, because you don't even care enough about them to try to kill them. It's like walking down the street and knowing you're going to crush a lot of ants, but you're not killing them purposely. Yeah, you know you're going to kill them, but they're so lowly, who cares? We do that all the time. Like, say, one of Clinton's minor crimes, or much worse ones. But one minor crime in 1998 was sending missiles to destroy most of the pharmaceutical supplies in Sudan, a poor African country. Anybody who had a brain functioning that knew that that was going to kill a huge number of people, apparently tens of thousands. But when it's just anybody who points that, here's whoever asked that question about things you're not allowed to talk about, here's another one. I've pointed that out, and that also elicits horror and hysteria, because we didn't purposely kill them. We just carried out an act that we knew was going to kill them, but we cared so little about them that we didn't try to kill them, like ants on the sidewalk. Well, that's standard practice of powerful states. It's called depraved indifference, but that doesn't capture the enormity of it. So yes, the terror should be called terror and should be criticized. And in accord with the usual moral principle, we should focus primarily on our own terror. First, because it's our own, and secondly, because it's massive.
Thanks for being here.
I'm sorry, for the sake of time, we're going to be able to take 2 more questions, so I'm sorry.
Thanks for being here, Professor. What I'm wondering is, what is, this kind of off topic, what is the right solution for Afghanistan?
For Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's confusing with, Obama sending more troops and what the Taliban's doing and the public government in Afghanistan. I'm not really sure what's going on.
Well, I have my own opinion about it. I've written about it.
I'd like to know your opinion.
Pardon?
I'd like to know your opinion. Your opinion.
My opinion. Well, I've written about it in no more detail, but the fact of the matter is that a substantial peace movement in Pakistan, it could very well be a majority of the populations. It's calling for an end to violence, put down the weapons, and aid in reconstruction. So the foreigners are fine, but we want them here for aid and reconstruction. Now, even according to Western polls, which are trying to build up support for sending troops, it's conceded that about 75% of the population wants to have negotiations among Afghans, which includes the Taliban, because they're Afghans. And in fact, President Karzai has said that he would invite Mullah, the head of the Taliban. It's one of the reasons he's so unpopular. He wants to talk about negotiation among Afghans to try to reach a peaceful settlement in their own traditional way, through a jirga, council. Okay, I think that's probably the right direction to go. More killing and more violence, I think, is exactly the wrong direction to go.
Professor Chomsky, thank you for coming. I was wondering, I realize that you don't want to focus on the Israeli state so much, but our own primarily. I was wondering if just for a second you could say what you think the role of the Israeli government, the structure of it, which is rather peculiar, plays in perpetuating the era of Israeli conflict.
Well, just speaking politically, as far as political arrangements are concerned, by comparative standards, the Israeli government functions by what's called democratic procedures. So you can make criticisms of what's a representative democracy, which is as good an example as any other, apart from the at least for the Jewish part of the population. The 80% Jewish part, the 20% non-Jewish part is different.
But the coalition structure.
The current coalition?
Yeah, where the minority groups end up having significant power, being able to
I
sway.
think that's a good idea. I mean, I think I'd like to have proportional representation here too. It would give a chance for view. I mean, we have basically a one-party system in the United States. There's a business party, business-owned party, which has two factions, which are a little different. But they both get essentially the same funding, the same people in office and so on and so forth. I don't think that's a good system. If we had proportional representation, other voices could be heard.
Thank you.
Do you believe the United States should sign the International Criminal Court Agreement? And do you think it levels the playing field between nations within power relations? And how much would that affect U.S. foreign policy?
Well, yes, I think it ought to sign the International Criminal Court Agreement. I also think it should subject itself to the authority of the World Court. The U.S. is right now the only country in the world that has rejected a World Court decision, namely its terrorist war against Nicaragua. And I don't agree with that. On the other hand, would it change policy? Well, take a look at the U.S. political culture. I mean, Congress passed a law which George Bush signed, which in Europe is called the Netherlands Invasion Act. It authorized the president to use force to rescue any American brought to the International Criminal Court. I don't know what to say about this. In fact, the press doesn't know what to say about it either, so they're keeping quiet. But it's legislation passed by a big congressional majority, signed by the president. Just as the press completely supported, the intellectual culture supported the U.S. rejection of the World Court decision. The U.S. not only rejected it, it vetoed 2 Security Council resolutions calling on states to observe international law. It didn't mention the United States, right? That's what they meant. Did you ever study that in class? Did you ever read about it anywhere? I think this is totally outrageous. And incidentally, the majority of Americans agree. And a large majority of Americans think that the United Nations ought to take the lead in international crises. A majority support giving up the veto at the Security Council and just following the majority will. We don't like it. And a considerable majority say yes, we should be subject to the authority of the international judicial system. But the population is just off the spectrum. Not just on these issues, on many issues. There's a big gap between policy and public opinion, domestic and international. Well, that's one of the reasons why electoral campaigns here run the way they are. Electoral campaigns here are really kind of extravaganzas run by the public relations industry, and they know it. So, for example, the Advertising Age, the main journal of the public relations industry, they give an annual award for the best marketing campaign of the year. In 2008, they gave it to the Obama campaign. And executives, high executives, spoke exultantly in the business press about how we've been selling candidates like commodities ever since Reagan, but this is the best we've ever done. That's going to change the culture in corporate boardrooms and so on. And if you look at the campaigns avoid issues. Systematically avoid issues. So most people don't even know the positions of candidates on issues. What they focus on is personalities, body language, oratorical style, nice guy, this kind of thing. Qualities, as they're called in the public relations industry. You've got to focus on that and keep away from issues. And one of the reasons is they know perfectly well, they read polls, that on issues, both parties are well to the right of the public on a lot of issues. The domestic ones, like, say, healthcare, the international ones, like some of those I've talked about. So let's keep issues away from the public. It's none of their business. We'll handle it.
Thank you, Don.